said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And he built an altar of the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram continued on, journeying toward the Negev. So we see Abram is essentially moving down the country, moving from north to south, down the country. He travels as a wanderer. We understand from Hebrews 11 verses 9 and 10 that he lived as a wanderer, as a vagabond. And so here we find him simply essentially following generally the Jordan River in its course down to the southern area of Canaan and into what is called the Negev, which is the sort of a desert area, a dry area there to the south and east of the land of Canaan. Here then we come across an episode where this really represents the first trial of Abram's faith. Verse 10, now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman, and it will come about when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. And they came about that when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, and Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh with his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh said to Abram, and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, this is my sister? So that I took her for my wife. Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away, and he with his wife and all that belonged to him. We find here a number of again interesting points about this passage here. We see here in the Bible, we really understand that the Bible records the good and the bad, and therefore this is not a novel we're reading where the hero is always strong and virtuous and never stumbles. No, we see real people doing real things. And that is part of the proof of the Bible, is that we see real people doing real things. And here we see Abram, and he comes down, he's living in the Negev, there's a famine in the land, and we understand there's no command from God that he should move, and yet you begin to think about, well, maybe he is considering, hey, we're running out of food and I need to do something about it. And instead of trusting in the Lord or inquiring of the Lord, he starts making his own choices. He decides, well, I'll go down into Egypt. And so he travels to Egypt. And so he, like Christians do today, instead of being patient where they are, instead of being comfortable where they are, or at least being taking action where they are, they decide, no, I think I'll try and look for something else. I'll try and look for something better somewhere. And so I'll go traveling. And so he takes off, and he goes off into the land of Egypt. These Egyptians, of course, we understand they are the descendants of Ham through Ham's son Mizraim. They were also polytheistic. They were also an immoral group, just like or similar to the Canaanites. And so here is Abram once again finding himself in contact with peoples that do not share his religion. And so again, we understand that, or we can see here God has given him these promises. He's promised him, you're going to have descendants. You're going to have, you and Sarai are going to have children, and those descendants are going to own the earth, are going to own this land. And instead of Abram trusting in God to see that that's done, he starts making all these arrangements with Sarai, his wife. Well, now you tell Pharaoh that I'm your brother rather than I'm your husband, because if they find out I'm your husband, they'll kill me. It kind of puts the question about how, here's Abram with his faith wavering, if we can put it that way. And I think that's a fair thing to say. We see Abram with his faith wavering a bit, and we come to realize that, yes, just like Christians today, sometimes Abram's faith wasn't as strong as it should have been or needed to be. And sometimes he kind of got a little weak-kneed as far as his ability to follow up with what God had promised him. And so, again, we see in this example, here's a real man doing real things. So he instructs Sarai. She tells the Egyptians a half-truth, that yes, this is my brother. Well, that was literally true. He was her half-brother. They both had the same father, but they had different mothers, and they were married, which was not, we find, an uncommon circumstance in this time. In fact, there are archaeological records of similar marriage arrangements between people that have been found where a man would marry his half-sister. Yeah. His niece? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Uh-huh. There. Yeah. Yeah, so both the grandfather and father died, and so that makes Abram, or at least in this particular case, puts Abram in charge of this particular family group. And but yeah, that's a good point, Rita, that others have made that same observation, that they think that Sarai was the daughter not of Terah but of Haran, and would therefore, as you say, been the sister of Lot. And would have made her Abram's niece. That also does again support the idea that Abram was not the firstborn, that he was probably the youngest of that group of three that are named there as the sons of Terah, and so he may have been a relatively late addition to that family, so that here he is, his niece is not terribly much younger than he is. Again, when they come into Egypt, then we read the text there of what had happened. The Egyptians saw she's a beautiful woman, and they take her into Pharaoh's house, into his harem. And so here we have now a situation that Abram has created, where now it's going to require divine intervention in order to preserve the promise that God has made to Abram. God, here's Abram kind of maneuvering himself into a situation and putting himself in a condition where it's going to require something special to get out of it. Josephus tells us that, as it says here, that it says here that the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with a great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Josephus tells us, as recorded in his history, says God's plague upon Pharaoh was a serious physical disorder, a distemper, and also a sedition among his government, whereupon he inquired of the priests how he might be freed of such calamities, and they told him that they were due to the wrath of God caused by his taking a stranger's wife. So you kind of wonder, how did Pharaoh come to a knowledge that, hey, I've taken another man's wife? Well, here's the answer. Perhaps in Josephus, if we trust his historical record, this distemper would have been something on the order of, as it's described in some of the texts, like a severe case of the flu. If you can imagine a severe case of the flu with high fever and with nausea and other upsets of the digestive system, and so here is Pharaoh, who is supposedly the God King Pharaoh, and suddenly he's being hit with what looks like a really bad case of the flu, and so as a result of that, then even his sort of his royal court begins to question his authority, his divinity. And so you can see where the sedition might come from. And suddenly he's got a crisis. Suddenly Pharaoh's met with a crisis. He goes to his priests. Hey, what's going on here? Perhaps it's been revealed by God to them. Hey, you've taken another man's wife. I'm not going to permit that. The priests relay that message to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh begins to understand what's going on. I would also note, though, if we go back to verse 16, where we find out that here is Pharaoh giving Abram a whole lot of gifts and other wealth on behalf of his wife Sarai. And apparently he allows Abram to keep all that stuff, all that riches, and he's allowed to leave then out of Egypt with it. This idea of commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away. That yes, that may have been exactly that, a military escort, basically to show Abram to the border. Thanks for visiting and don't come back. Would have been the message to Abram, given what has happened here. Some of the skeptics look at this story and they notice that it's repeated twice. Abram will pull this same stunt on another guy. We're going to read here later on in the book of Genesis. We'll find another account of Abram doing the same stunt with another guy, and then we find where Isaac does it as well. And some of the skeptics look at this and go, "Come on, one time we might be able to believe, but three times." Well, for one thing, though, we don't understand the culture that's engaged here. We don't understand what's going on with that culture. Apparently, yes, there was a need for these men to, or at least they thought with these men that they needed to conceal their relationship with their wives, because apparently it was not necessarily uncommon that a king who wanted to have a particular woman for his wife would find a way to get her. We also find that this becomes a habit, or not a habit exactly, but a cultural viewpoint, if we can put it that way, a cultural viewpoint of the Jews, that they come to understand. Hey, we're of the Messiah, the line of the Messiah. Given that we're of the line of the Messiah, God is going to protect that line, and so long as the Messiah has not come, we will be protected by God. Some of the commentators have pointed out that even in the Roman siege of Jerusalem, that several of the Jewish leaders were going around trying to encourage their men, their troops, by promising them that, hey, since the Messiah hasn't come yet, there's nothing to worry about. We're going to be safe, without, of course, realizing that indeed the Messiah had already come. We go into chapter 13. Unless there's questions on chapter 12, we go then continue on then to chapter 13. Now, John preached about this last Sunday, and so I almost have a temptation to just have Dave put that DVD up and show you that sermon again. No, Dave, I don't think we're going to do that, but it's an idea. It would be a thought. But John did speak about this. John talked about Lot and Abram and the situation here as we go into chapter 13. It says, as we read here in the first part of this chapter, then Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and they went in the journey from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and tents. Now some of the critics look at this and try and argue, well, there's you have to, one of the things you need to understand about the book of Genesis is that for a number of years there have been schools of thought about this book, about Genesis, that it is in fact, they will try to argue, the composition not of one author but of many. And they will speculate a number of types of authors. I think they have something like at least 6 or 8 different potential authors that they try to identify, and they'll refer to the P text and the M text, and they'll try to come up with a number of textual variants that they try to find within the book of Genesis to suggest that it was written by more than one author. You have to understand that all the speculation about various foundational texts is pure speculation. No one has ever found a text that supports this theory. It is all purely the imagination of these guys who see this. And one of the things that they argue here from Genesis, the 13th chapter, is that, well, no, wait a minute. Here it talks about Lot. Lot was with him. And yet we find no mention at all of Lot in the 12th chapter. And so therefore, there must have been some kind of a shift in the story, a shift in the author, and they've got to introduce Lot back into the storyline. So they indicate that here's Lot with Abram again, where he wasn't mentioned in the 12th chapter and wasn't mentioned ever going into Egypt. Well, the problem with that line of reasoning on their part lies in verse 10. Because if you read down in verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the valley of the Jordan. It was well watered everywhere, and he saw before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go into Zoar. How would Lot know what the land of Egypt looked like going into Zoar unless he'd been there? And so the answer is that here, obviously, or at least the text certainly supports the idea that Lot was mentioned. That Lot went with Abram into Egypt. The fact that Lot wasn't mentioned in it is of no consequence because Lot didn't really factor into the storyline at that point. But the fact is that here is a bit of information we are given that clearly indicates Lot was familiar with what the land of Egypt looked like and therefore had gone with Abram into Egypt. As we go on here, he says, and the land could not sustain them while dwelling there, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling in the land. So here you see what's happening. Their flocks have increased. They've gained wealth coming out of Egypt. Now they have considerably more wealth in the form of livestock, sheep and cattle and what have you. And now they're not only are they in competition with each other, with their herdsmen, but they're also in competition with the folks that are already living in this land, the Canaanite and the Perizzite. And the bottom line is there simply isn't enough sustenance in the land to sustain everybody. And so a decision has to be made. Then Abram said to Lot, verse 8, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsman and your herdsman, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me to the left. If to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if to the right, then I will go to the left. Here's Abram. Now, Abram is the leader of this family group that's come out of Mesopotamia. And to him really is the right of the first choice. He really does have the right of the first choice as far as where they're going to go. Lot really is subordinate to Abram. And yet we find here a measure of Abram's generosity in that he tells, and John spoke of this again on Sunday night, and if you didn't see that sermon, I would recommend it to you. It is a good one. But he generously gives the choice to Lot. We're not certain what the geography of this area would have been at this time. There is some thought, though, that the Jordan River continued through a valley that would have run down this area, and then it would have turned westward and flowed through the sort of the southern part of Canaan and into the Jordan River through an ancient riverbed now called a wadi down in that area. I was looking for a good graphic, couldn't find one. But what we have here in that the geography of this area is a meeting of what we now know are three tectonic plates. Right there in the Jordan River is what's called the East African Rift. And there is a tectonic plate there. There's a tectonic plate, the Asian tectonic plate coming in from the east, and then a southern tectonic plate coming in from the south. And these three plates meet there. And so when we get to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we'll come to understand how this change in geography took place. That created what we now know is the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea wasn't always there. There may have been a continual valley running through the Jordan River, then running out through this wadi into the Mediterranean. It would have been perhaps an area of a number of pools of water, pools or lakes, even what we would call a lake. And it could have then therefore given this whole region that idea of being well watered, that it would have been being supplied with water down from the Jordan River. And as Abram looks on it, he decides, well, I'm going to go east. He decides that's where the good ground is, and I'm going to go to the east and go live there. As he says here, that's what we saw in verse 10. He's going to go towards the east. So Lot chose for himself the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Some commentators have suggested that this was providential on the part of God, that God wanted to separate Abram from Lot because Lot was not perhaps the kind of man that Abram should be living around, should be near. I personally disagree with that because I see if we read the passage in 2 Peter, and I think again John pointed this out on in his sermon, if I recall. last Sunday. But on 2 Peter 2 and verse 7, it says there, back to verse 6. If he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example of those who would live ungodly thereafter, and if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of imprisonable men, for by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day with their lawless deeds. And so here we find this description of Lot contained in the book of Peter as a righteous man, that he was a righteous man whose soul was being kind of tormented. Yes, he was a righteous man. He may not have been the smartest guy or the wisest fellow, because he picks. We find that he picks this material gain, this potential material gain, over the righteousness of continuing to serve God, over having faith in God. And so he makes a fairly smart business but foolish life choice. And that's what we find here. He makes a fairly foolish life choice in going to live among people he has no business living among. Comments or questions? Yeah, Rick? Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
You can just hear the herdsmen arguing back and forth. Well, Abram was one that got thrown out. Just hear this fight between the brothers of who was responsible for him.
That's a good point. Yeah, you could almost hear it's your fault. It's all your fault. We're tossed out of Egypt, where we had plenty of land to graze, and now we're living in this desert. Where we can't find enough water and grass for our flocks. And so you may have a point there. There may have been some finger pointing. There may have been some trying to assign blame and so forth. And so that may be an interesting point, that may have been part of the strife between these herdsmen, that one group is wanting to blame the other group because you basically ruined a good deal for us. And so, good point. That's an interesting point. Yeah.
We read this, we always read it because we have the hindsight to think, oh, there's a crucial error Lot made.
That's right.
His faith wasn't strong enough. He didn't realize his faith wasn't strong enough. We do that same thing all the time. In our life, we make decisions that are not based on faith, and then we're stunned when it goes awry on us.
Yeah, it's that law of unintended consequences. And
my faith will stand up, except
that's right. It hasn't been. Yes, that's a good point. We do. We sometimes put our faith to the test, and then we suddenly are, as you point out, Todd. That's a great point. We are sometimes stunned when things go awry. When we make some choice that's not according to a reliance on God. That's not according to conforming our lives to God's will, and then we're stunned, we're surprised by the outcome. And that's kind of that's an excellent point. Certainly we see that happening with Lot. You can imagine if you could have gone back and told Lot, if you go down there, your whole family is going to get wiped out, and you're going to end up having children incestuously with your daughters. Can you imagine, what his reaction would have been? I can imagine he would have responded with great consternation, and you would have insulted him. What an indignity! What an insult! And yet, that's exactly what happened to him. We know that's exactly, you've got a point. That, yeah, 2020 hindsight is crystal clear, but when you're standing there kind of looking over that valley and going, boy, that sure looks nice down there. I could make a lot of money. I could get my herds even bigger by going down there. And you don't see the danger. You don't understand the danger. That's a good point, Todd. All right. We then get into the latter part of this chapter, which is this land promise then that's given to Abram and his descendants. We see here, Abram then settled in verse 14, then the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, and I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. And so here is this land promise now that's given to Abram. Basically, look north, south, east, and west, and whatever you see, I'm going to give it to you and your descendants forever. Now, some folks, especially today, are trying to they will point to this verse, and they will say, oh, look, here's this land promise that's given to Abram and to his descendants, and therefore that land promise still holds for the modern day nation of Israel, and therefore the Christian today has a duty, has an obligation to support this modern day nation of Israel, because that is part of God's promise to Abram, and so that's still in effect, is the argument as it goes. And so does that, the question we can ask is, does that promise give authorization to the modern state of Israel to claim this area? Does it give authority to Christians today to be supporting that nation because they have this land right that's given to them, and they're through Abraham forever? And if we consider that, the answer, I think, if we look at it really, we begin to realize that no, this was not unconditional. This was never intended to be unconditional. God had made it clear that it was conditional on the descendants, that they would be faithful to him, that they would be respectful of him and of his will. And then we might ask ourselves, who are Abram's descendants today? Does that continue to be the sort of the biological descendants of Abram through that lineage of the modern Jews, or is that someone else? As we look at the New Testament, we begin to see a number of passages that will answer that question. We look over at Galatians, for example. In the book of Galatians, this is the argument that Paul uses a number of times. But I'm going to start with what he's written here in Galatians. Here in Galatians 3 and verse 7, he says, Galatians 3 and verse 7, therefore be sure it is those who are of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations shall be blessed in you. So then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer. And so here we find in this opening passage that no, it is not the physical descendant of Abram that is being blessed and should be considered as the candidate for the blessing, but rather the spiritual descendant of Abram, as Paul suggests here in chapter 3. He goes on in verse 29. Start backing up in verse 27. So all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free man. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. And so there we see here who Paul considered to be the descendant of Abraham, and the modern day descendant of Abraham being the Christian, being that one who has faith in God and faith in his Messiah. And so therefore, we have that understanding. We see the same kind of writing. Paul again makes it, and this is in the book of Romans, and in the 9th chapter. 9th chapter, beginning in verse 6, it says, "But it is not as though the word of God has failed, for they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel, neither are all the children because they are Abraham's descendants, but through Isaac your descendants will be named. That is, it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise who are regarded as descendants. And for this is the word of promise, at this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins had not yet born, had not done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose according to his choice might stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger, just as is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Again, we see the argument here that Paul makes. Paul is describing this, that it is the children of promise who are the ones who are the heirs. And he describes the children of promise as being of those who are obedient to the will of God. We find here again in this passage in Genesis that God then commands, he says, arise, walk through the land. We can assume that Abraham did so. He did walk through the land. And then he finally stopped at Hebron on the west side of the Jordan River. Here's a map. This kind of map, if you can read this pretty well, it kind of gives some idea of the journeys of Abram. He starts down here in Ur. And we see that he goes up this way, following the rivers up, and comes to Haran. That is in this northern part, where in Haran, where his father dies, of course, while they are living there. And from there, then, of course, we again recall that God gives him instruction to leave from this area and go into Canaan. And so we can assume that he would have followed these rivers and roadways, or at least passageways, down into Canaan. We find him in Hazor right here. We find him in Shechem here. We find him down into the lower parts of Canaan. He then, of course, goes over into Egypt. We find him over here in Egypt for a period of time. Basically, he's kicked out. He's kicked out of Egypt, and he goes and lives in the Negev, which would have been over in this area. Generally, in this area is the Negev. And from there, then he travels up, and now finally ends up back at Hebron, right here in southern Canaan, southeastern Canaan. And so that is Abraham's journey. You can understand what a tremendous amount of travel this would involve for him. Would have been fairly extraordinary for someone of this time, and yet there he is. All right, we're going to stop there. We'll continue with chapter 14 next week. I appreciate your attention this morning. Jonah? That's a good story. I like that story.